After spending 3 months on the same batch of episodes, it is such a breath of fresh air to move on to new stuff. Since I don't have anything specific I'd like to discuss here, at least nothing I'm not saving for later, I thought it might be worth discussing my own history with WordGirl in a bit more depth. I can't remember exactly when I started watching the show, but considering how I was already watching PBS Kids before the first episode premiered in 2007, it was probably from the start. I at least somewhat remember the vast majority of episodes from seasons 1 and 2. Season 3, which aired from September 2010 to July 2011, is where my knowledge becomes much spottier. I do remember seeing a few episodes like Bampy Battles Bots and A Better Mousetrap at least once each, and I swear I somehow saw a showdown at the secret spaceship hideout multiple times, but most episodes from then on I just never saw as the show was airing. Ironically, based on episode count, seasons 1 through 3 comprises the first half of the show, so I guess I saw a little more of it than I thought. At this point, my attention wandered mostly to Nickelodeon sitcoms of the time, the nascent Marvel Cinematic Universe, video games, though I was that one kid who felt morally obligated to avoid Call of Duty and its ilk, and video game content on YouTube. Years later, when I was in high school, I believe this was at some point after the final episode aired, I went on a nostalgia kick for various PBS Kids shows, including WordGirl. Not sure if you can tell, but that nostalgia kick still hasn't 100% faded. WordGirl hasn't exactly been a lifelong passion for me. I'd say the media that comes closest to that are Mario and Power Rangers, but it's definitely had its claws in me long enough that it was really easy to get back into it when I hit my nostalgia phase. So now that we've effectively hit the present, let's continue with this occult ritual to summon a retrospective.
Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow.
Becky, Bob, and Tim are waiting in line for the midnight release of Princess Triana and the Ogre of Castlebum, the latest entry in a series of fantasy books that Becky loves. Tobey also shows up, annoyed by the long line, but decides to go and attack the publisher's building to steal a copy and read it as soon as possible. Overhearing his schemes, Becky flies off to stop Tobey. Tobey gets away, but he is prevented from stealing a copy. Later, Tobey attacks an armored car taking the books to the bookstore. WordGirl confronts Tobey and he retaliates by reading the book aloud, threatening to spoil it. He eventually traps WordGirl in the armored car, and she is tempted to read one of the remaining copies for herself before Huggy frees her. WordGirl and Huggy track down Tobey via...
Will Tobey's secret reading spot in the belly of his robot ever be revealed?
divine intervention, and Huggy tears out the last few pages of the book to prevent Tobey from learning the ending. Tobey is delivered to his mother, and Becky seemingly misses out on getting her own copy before the bookstore owner reveals she set one aside specially for her. This is another example of an episode that's endearing in its low stakes. While Tobey is trying to steal something, it ultimately amounts to a single book and him knowing the ending slightly earlier than everyone else. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but that goes both ways. I love how petulant Tobey is about being able to read a book at the first possible opportunity. Rather ironic that he attempted to destroy a library a few episodes ago if he likes reading so much. However, Tobey isn't the only one being petulant. WordGirl herself is made to face significant temptation for the first time, and it's rather engaging. We know that she's a big fan of the Princess Triana books, so it makes sense that she ends up risking Tobey getting away to read the new book early. While she may be more mature than Tobey, she is still a kid, still sometimes prone to her vices. This allows Tobey to use the risk of spoilers to throw her off, a pretty clever move on his part. Ultimately, this low-stakes environment playing off the fact that the protagonist and antagonist are both children makes this a very fun story in a similar way to something like Arthur. Huggy, the adult, gets to act as straight man to both of them. Outside of the conflict with Tobey, the B-plot, of sorts, is everything taking place in line at the bookstore. Reginald and the museum curator surprisingly get roles here, as they're apparently both fans of the books. There's not that much to say about them, but have you ever wanted to see Reginald and Tobey interact?
I was including you in that riffraff.
That's funny, I was including you. Double humph.
You're welcome. We also get the new character Miss Libri, the bookstore owner. She's a sweet woman who's friends with Becky, and this friendship pays off when Miss Libri sets aside a copy of the book for Becky. I want to say this is trying to make a subtle point about how being nice to people and being patient is the way to get what you want, as opposed to what Tobey was doing, but I'm pretty sure I'm just overthinking things. In any case, Miss Libri was just a warm, enjoyable character. She feels like what Miss Champlain would be if Becky was an art prodigy like Violet. One last detail I really like about the episode is the progression of what the audience learns about the book. Early on, we're told a basic rundown of how the last book ended, with Princess Triana hanging from a cliff.
And that's why he's called Cliffhanger!
And as Tobey reads, we're given more and more details about the new book. I especially like how everything that's said can allow you to figure out the book's big twist before the narrator blurts it out at the end of the episode. It's like we're reading the book alongside the characters in a way. It's rather charming. And that's probably the word I'd use to describe the episode as a whole. Charming. It's a fun romp where the characters' reactions to the situations are hugely exaggerated, but you end up sympathizing with these reactions regardless.
Wait, Tobey! Don't reveal any more! If we already know what happens, it'll ruin all the fun!
Ugh, this episode created modern spoiler culture, I can just tell.
When a cool drop of water fell on me.
As a heat wave grips the city, Tim plans to take the kids to a water park, but Becky soon learns that Granny May is going on a crime spree. WordGirl and Granny May fight, but since WordGirl is struck with heat exhaustion and Granny's mechanical armor is equipped with air conditioning, Granny easily wins. Becky stops back home, stopping TJ and Tim from leaving without her, but leaves again to stop Granny May from robbing an ice cream truck.
Hand over the money now, or I will use my jetpack to melt all the ice cream!
Truly, Granny May is the most vile threat in this entire show. Granny May ties up some civilians in her thick yarn, forcing WordGirl to help them while Granny escapes again. Becky gets back home, but Granny May sends out a message over radio calling out WordGirl for a final battle. WordGirl again succumbs to heat exhaustion, and Granny May is seemingly about to bring an end to her. Granny is low-key the most ruthless villain on the show, really, but Huggy uses bags of ice to trick her suit into switching from cooling mode to heating mode. Panicked, Granny May removes her suit and is quickly apprehended. Becky gets back home just in time to go to the water park, but a rainstorm immediately starts up. The Botsfords go anyway, however, and are apparently able to get a rainy day discount. Okay, first off, I love the yellow tint over everything. It's simple, but goes a long way to making the atmosphere of a blistering summer day. The final chase in particular stacks this with glow effects and hallucinations that really put you in the mindset of a superhero who can't stand the heat. Second, I love the premise of a criminal taking advantage of air conditioning to run circles around WordGirl and everyone else. Granny May using her armor like this is a neat change of pace from her usual shtick, and I like to think her more brazen activities here are a direct result of how much more vulnerable everyone else is. She doesn't really need subterfuge this time, although this does have the knock-on effect of removing her unique aspects and making her feel a bit more generic. Third, I love how Granny May is defeated. I thought Huggy was going to use the ice bags to rejuvenate WordGirl, but messing with Granny's air conditioning instead, turning the villain's greatest asset against them, is way more clever. Fourth, I like the TJ and Tim subplot. This is one of those situations where Becky's efforts as WordGirl actually have a concrete negative effect on those in her personal life, so you sympathize with TJ tempting Tim to leave without her, even if it's not that fair when you know the full story. Tim definitely feels like one of those kid-at-heart characters. He's very susceptible to TJ's suggestions to leave Becky behind, he's just as excited as the two of them for the water park, and he even gets a little whiny when Becky goes off to catch a big armored butterfly for the third time. Also, I didn't notice until now, but is Tim supposed to be a stay-at-home dad? He spends a lot of time at home while Sally is seemingly at work, and he doesn't seem to have a job of his own. That's cool. This episode also has a bit more of the WordGirl tempted to abandon her responsibilities thing from last episode, but it's less pronounced and more played for comedy than anything.
Like it or not, as long as Granny's out there, it's our job to find her. Good point, Bob. Splashy as it is.
While I'm torn on the decision to use Granny May while stripping away all her distinct traits, this is overall a fun episode with an entertaining premise and a really immersive atmosphere. This is the sort of thing you might watch during an actual heatwave to really get into it, like how you'd watch your favorite Christmas specials during the Christmas season.
The only ice cream we want is the ice cream of justice. That sounded better in my head.
Wham episode. The point in a series where the story takes a sudden dramatic turn. Things will never be quite the same again.
Chuck is at the park plotting to steal an artifact that can amplify his sandwich powers when he runs into the Whammer, an aspiring supervillain with the power to wham, basically just create shockwaves. The Whammer insists on becoming Chuck's sidekick, and Chuck reluctantly plays along.
Wait a minute. Chuck the Sandwich?
Actually, it's,
I heard of you!
Wow, can you imagine getting Chuck's name wrong like that? WordGirl and Huggy confront the new villainous duo at the jewelry store, but the Whammer ends up accidentally destroying the Emerald Sub, the artifact Chuck wanted. WordGirl lets slip that Huggy can get annoying sometimes, upsetting him, and the Whammer and Chuck escape. Chuck learns on the news that the jewelry store happens to have a second Emerald sub in the back.
How convenient.
But it's also revealed that 2 special pillows are on display at local antique stores.
They may look like pillows, but I assure you they're called whammers.
Okay, I looked it up. This is not a thing. The writers just made this up. The whammer runs off for the pillows WordGirl and Huggy make up, and at the antique store...
Hold it right there!
Wham wham.
Did we just get beat by a pillow?
Maybe there is something special about these things. Chuck calls WordGirl to alert her to their next location, and Huggy is eventually able to restrain the whammer's hands with tape. Chuck complains about the whammer, who doesn't seem to absorb the point, and the two are apprehended. So first off, the whammer has the most over-the-top personality in the show so far, which is quite the achievement. You get the sense he doesn't do crime because he's greedy or anything, but just because it's really fun for him. One thing I noticed is that this first appearance shows him a little more likely to quiet down and not be so bombastic.
Listen, sandwich guy, you helped the whammer. Now the whammer's going to help you.
I wouldn't say he gets flanderized or anything later on, but I remember the whammer being loud and forceful pretty much 100% of the time in his future appearances. He doesn't have much of a theme compared to the other villains, but this also serves the purpose of making him a bit more versatile. You can put him anywhere and it'll probably work. This is an especially good idea with his designated sidekick thing here. It doesn't actually last very long after this, but that might actually be a good thing given that pairing him with other villains could very easily just become a repeat of him and Chuck here. And speaking of the main victim of the whammer's behavior, Whammer comes off like an overeager fan in his interactions with Chuck, especially early on. And this won't be the last time we see a dynamic like this. He's less eager to please and more blinded by his eagerness. He wants to be a good sidekick, but doesn't actually listen to Chuck's requests for how. Chuck gets roped into this because he hesitates too much on telling the whammer off, but it's also clear that doing so wouldn't help much anyway. This is another case of Chuck being the bad guy, but still suffering from misfortune that makes you feel bad for him. He even interrupts a definition because he's bummed about the Emerald sub getting destroyed.
Well, exasperated means...
Wait, if you're about to define exasperated, please don't. I'm not in the mood.
And at the end, when Chuck asks for him and Whammer to get separate cells, WordGirl sympathizes with him herself. But speaking of WordGirl, the conflict between her and Huggy is really the weak link here. Revealing that WordGirl gets annoyed with Huggy sometimes makes sense, paralleling Chuck and Whammer and playing into the featured word exasperate, but it's not executed well. It pops up halfway through with no build-up, ends before the next fight just as abruptly, and is not elaborated on. We don't even know what Huggy does to annoy her, and her reassurances just consist of generic inspirational talk. It feels really phoned in. I'm reminded of when a similar conflict occurred between WordGirl and the narrator in Mr. Big's debut, and I think the potential solution is similar here. Build it up as a running gag more and be more specific as to the issues at hand. We see WordGirl and Huggy doing some cleanup at the beginning of the episode, and that would have been a perfect opportunity. Show that Huggy is hoarding junk or something, and WordGirl is annoyed by this. It honestly feels like something like that was intended, but got cut for time. Ultimately though, this subplot is such a minor feature that Chuck and Whammer's more entertaining interactions significantly outweigh it. It gets a little repetitive admittedly, but the Whammer is so bombastic that it's hard to care. Of the new villains introduced in Season 1, he might honestly be my favorite.
Well, I wanted a glass of milk to help me calm down, and it was just sitting there in a tub of barbecue sauce.
I'm not going to question why a jewelry store has a vat of barbecue sauce. I am going to question why Reginald has a vat of barbecue sauce.
Hi, my name is not Gwen, it is Gwendolf.
When Dr. Two Brains wins a cruise vacation, he holds auditions for a substitute so he doesn't lose his current status while away. None of the auditions seem good enough.
Yeah! The whammer has 2 brains now, and he's gonna wham you with 2 brains.
The whammer hopes we haven't forgotten about him in the last 3 minutes, wham! But then arrives Glenn Furlbland, Two Brains' biggest fan, who fails as well, particularly when he suggests unnecessary changes and starts ranting about how smart he is.
Is it because you feel threatened because my ideas are so much better than yours?
Oh boy, he's just the embodiment of every stereotype about Reddit. Thanks to his pet cats, Glenn accidentally steals Two Brains' lab coat, which convinces the henchman to work for him now. Becky, who's working on a bookbinding machine for a science fair, goes off to stop the henchmen at City Hall, but when she learns they're just putting up a statue made of paste, which apparently isn't even illegal, she just goes back to her project. As Two Brains' reputation dwindles thanks to Glenn's actions, Becky again is sidetracked from her project to stop the henchmen from buying all the grocery store's cheese on sale. Glenn shows up in a terrible Two Brains disguise and uses a fondue ray to escape WordGirl, but she goes to follow him. After WordGirl learns what's going on, Glenn threatens to turn everyone present into goop, but he just hits a giant vat.
What was in it?
Goop?
Wait,
So all Glenn did was turn a vat of goop into more goop?
Glenn is tied up, Two Brains goes on his cruise, and WordGirl takes the goop for her bookbinding machine, but loses to the most generic science project ever courtesy of Scoops. So you know how classically evil villains are sometimes described as someone you love to hate? I'd actually argue that most WordGirl villains don't actually fall under this because they have enough endearing qualities that it's easy to unironically like them, at least on some level. Glenn Furlblam is a character that was specifically designed to be hateable, though not in the usual way. He's the most pathetic villain on the show, not even committing any actual crimes in this first appearance, and yet is so obnoxiously arrogant that you relish him getting refuted by Two Brains and easily defeated by WordGirl. If most of the show's villains are eccentric street performers, then Glenn is a guy playing an off-key harmonica and yelling at everyone who passes by without giving him money. The funny thing is that Two Brains is also a very egocentric villain, shown in this episode when his reputation is marred by Glenn's actions, but he at least knows his limits and isn't bragging about actual failures. Two Brains wants to be the best villain, while Glenn thinks he is the best villain despite knowing nothing about villainy. The episode's subplot is... okay. I like how Becky is increasingly shown to be very smart, but with her intelligence concentrated into very specific fields. Previously with art and now with science, she tends to have trouble with things outside of language. Though I will say, if she did get it working properly, I would absolutely name her bookbinding machine the winner. I like how the subplot connects to the main plot at the very end when WordGirl takes Two Brains' goop for the machine. I appreciate it when subplots feel more like part of the same story and less like a different story that we sometimes cut to. And Scoops' presence is pretty inconsequential, but I think him offering to bring Becky to the crime scenes is tying back to him making her his assistant back in Shrinking in the Ray, and he does get a really funny moment.
But I have to, work on my project.
Oh, not sure why you're talking like that.
But yeah, Glenn is the lowlight of the episode in the best way possible. He's not threatening at all outside of him trying, and failing, to kill everyone in the warehouse, and it's both hilarious to see him rant and satisfying to see him constantly put down.
All things cute and cuddly.
Oh, that's enough for me.
Okay, I'm gonna get all my cuteness reactions out of the way now so it doesn't get annoying later.
Oh, he's so cute and so tiny, and oh, he's waving. Oh, it's so cute.
Alright, we're good. Becky is distracted from a game of charades against her dad when she's alerted to a robbery at a shoe store. The culprit turns out to be the butcher, who reveals his newest weapon, an adorable little kitten named Meat Hook. Butcher is disappointed when Meat Hook fails to maul the superheroes, but he does take advantage of them being paralyzed by the kitten's cuteness to restrain them. Back at his lair, Butcher realizes the potential of exploiting the kitten's cuteness and gives him a new name, Lil Mittens. The Butcher uses Lil Mittens to distract people while he robs the bank and then to once again overcome WordGirl. After a montage showing Butcher and Lil Mittens going on outings and bonding, they go to rob the jewelry store. Butcher puts Lil Mittens in a cat carrier while he fights WordGirl, but the kitten gets out while all parties are distracted. When Butcher realizes his cat is missing, he panics, and WordGirl naturally isn't pleased either. Butcher is soon reunited with Lil Mittens thanks to a little girl finding him, but the police soon arrive to arrest him. Butcher is distraught about being taken away from the kitten, but the girl offers to take care of him while Butcher is gone, and he graciously accepts. The Butcher was already capable of being very friendly and casual, but this episode brings out a different side of him. Early on, you'd think he spends the whole episode pushing Lil Mittens into being scary and struggling with his growing attachment to him.
I was expecting a little more from you. Why didn't you do to WordGirl what you did to the arms of my easy chair, huh?
Instead, he realizes where the kitten's true strengths lie very early on and embraces the affection he feels. The Butcher is clearly trying to be a good pet owner even as he uses Lil Mittens to commit crimes. He feeds him and makes sure to keep him safe and away from a potentially dangerous fight. He doesn't even seem to show any shame over this cutting into his villain cred or anything. He loves this cat and he isn't afraid to let people see it. The montage of the Butcher and Lil Mittens is the cutest moment in the show so far, and the Butcher's reaction to Lil Mittens going missing is both heartbreaking and kinda frightening.
This is all your fault, your fault!
Jack DiFerriolo, who also happens to have been head writer for season 1 and a recurring writer for the rest of the series, already conveyed the Butcher's personality expertly, but this episode is particularly good for showing his ability to inject more varied and intense emotion than you'd expect. This episode isn't just feel-good though, it also has a surprising amount of good jokes, which I suppose is still feel-good, technically speaking, just in a different way. WordGirl and Huggy's reactions to Little Mitten's cuteness is both funny and adorable, particularly as they start trying and failing to resist it later on. The civilians at the bank are similar, and they get a great payoff after the vile criminals flee the scene.
Say, don't we usually keep money in our bank?
The highlight of humor, though, doesn't actually involve Little Mittens at all. During the first robbery at the shoe store, the butcher runs into an employee who is shockingly cooperative.
Say, you look like a size 12, sir. We have the perfect shoes for you. Here, take a look.
All right, put them in the bag.
I just love when people are shown to be bored with this brand of chaotic villainy. The lowlight would unfortunately be the Botsford side of the story, which feels like another example of just filling space. It's not as bad as other examples, since it's amusing to see Becky fail at charades. I guess non-verbal communication isn't her thing. But it's a rather one-note joke, and Tim doesn't really get any funny lines aside from his final one after Becky leaves for the last time.
Becky? Bob? Hello? I'm alone.
But really, who's watching the adorable Butcher Adopts a Kitten episode for the high-octane charades action anyway?
He had one of those little paper hats that they wear in the butcher shop?
Wait, does the butcher actually run a store? Jeez, it's like if the grocery store manager turned out to be a villain.
WordGirl would never use a complicated word when a simple one like rain would suffice.
Mr. Big enacts his newest plan, involving a massive radio tower, a series of word suckers, microphones, planted around the city, and somehow WordGirl herself. Upon activation, the radio tower makes people speak with unnecessarily complicated words, forcing WordGirl to fly in and clear up the resulting confusion. More and more communication breakdowns occur, and the microphones are there to record all the definitions WordGirl gives. WordGirl is stressed by the increased responsibility, but welcomes the chance to use her vocabulary skills more often, until she finds one of the microphones and learns they're manufactured by Mr. Big Incorporated. Mr. Big, currently preparing to ship a new product, admits to his actions but distracts her by inflicting his big words mind control on the entire city. WordGirl is overwhelmed until she notices the radio tower and flies to destroy it, but is intercepted by a giant vacuum cleaner because giant vacuum cleaner.
It's my hero, sucker!
Let us go, Mr. Big!
Mr. Big then reveals his endgame: produce massive books filled with the definitions WordGirl provided. WordGirl quickly points out that dictionaries already exist, and Mr. Big is disappointed enough that he just lets WordGirl win from there. And here we have what's undoubtedly the most vocabulary-centric episode of the series so far. Adapting Mr. Big's mind control into making everyone speak in big words not only provides an excuse to define a bunch of words, it also makes vocabulary a major point of the villain's plot for the first time. Unless you want to count the game show in Tobey or Consequences. This in turn makes WordGirl's vocabulary skills an important plot point when previously it only served for word definitions and didn't affect the story much. And the episode is self-aware about this, showing WordGirl being happy to exercise those skills. It almost feels like it's building to another WordGirl tempted to abandon her responsibilities thing, the idea that she might let Mr. Big carry on so she can keep solving these issues, though the episode doesn't ultimately go for that. It even carries a message that, while vocabulary is important, it's also important to show restraint and pick the right word for the situation instead of just using the smartest sounding word you know.
Bigger is always better.
No, it's not. It's more important to use the right word than the biggest word.
And this message is something we'll be exploring again next season, ironically with another Mr. Big episode. The big word's mind control is also a decent vector for humor. Seeing citizens use unnecessarily complicated language is amusing in itself, but it also sets up for bigger jokes like Leslie showing up everywhere with microphones, a pair of pants being bought at a hot dog stand? And TJ becoming verbose as well, which is the one thing that makes WordGirl suspect something weird's going on. And it all builds up to the ultimate punchline of the episode, the reveal that Mr. Big's dastardly new product that will use the chaos in the city to make him rich is a dictionary, which he never knew existed.
Leslie, did you know about this?
Of course, sir.
Why didn't you say something?
I thought you just really wanted to write a dictionary.
This is one of the goofiest episodes in the series, fully embracing the show's silly concept to pack as much humor and education as it can into 11 minutes. There aren't that many specific jokes that stand out aside from the ones I already listed, but the general concept and tone are the key here. This is probably what you'd first expect from a show about a vocabulary superhero, but it's the best version of this story concept.
One last time, proceed or you will be apprehended.
But how can I proceed when I don't know what proceed means?
Dr. Two Brains shows off his newest invention.
The really big mechanical ear.
Of course. When the henchmen mess with the ear, a young girl's voice starts playing. Through this long-distance eavesdropping, Two Brains discovers WordGirl's secret identity and uses a map machine to pinpoint her location. Later, the Botsford's family dinner is interrupted by Two Brains showing up. Two Brains attempts to expose Becky to her family, but they don't believe him. Sally Botsford, district attorney, then makes a very absurd offer.
Dr. Two Brains, join us for dinner.
Mom!
Two Brains continually tries to convince the Botsfords that Becky is WordGirl, even pretending to get a word wrong to annoy Becky into exposing herself.
Let me look it up in the dictionary.
Dictionary?
How is it that 2 villain plots in a row have been foiled by the existence of dictionaries? Two Brains pretends to leave, but flings all the dishes into the air. Becky manages to catch them all while still reaffirming she's not WordGirl.
But honey, you're flying.
Two Brains takes the Botsfords back to his lair and reveals the next step of his plan. Use an amnesia ray to make Becky forget she's WordGirl. And I'm just gonna skip the rest of the summary because I guarantee you can figure out where it goes from here. As established previously, episodes where Becky's secret identity is threatened are pretty easily the tensest in the series. It's not just a generic "the villain might get away" or "WordGirl might die" that you'd expect from any episode. There's a specific and distinct set of consequences that would significantly impact her life, and it comes up rarely enough that it feels like more of an event. This episode takes the concept even farther though. We've seen a villain suspecting Becky is WordGirl, and we've seen a supporting character in that role as well, but this episode does both at once and shows them definitively discover it instead of just strongly suspecting it. After the dinner, there's nothing that Becky can do to cover things up, and it's only by a stroke of luck that everyone else forgets by the end. My favorite parts of the episode are the Botsfords' reactions to learning the truth. Sally and Tim are just shocked at first, but after they've had time to calm down a bit, they're actually shown to be happy and proud about it. Which makes sense. How would you feel if your kid turned out to be a hero who saved the entire city and you personally too many times to count by this point? Sally even gets to show her defensive side when Charlie briefly grabs WordGirl.
Leave my daughter alone!
Mom, I can handle this.
TJ, conversely, is upset and even disgusted by the truth. This also makes sense. Not only is he in a "my big sister is lame" phase, but considering how he's thought about WordGirl in the past?
You're awesome and pretty and awesome too.
Yeah, that's an understandable reaction. The idea of wiping WordGirl's memory to remove her as a threat is a clever plot on Two Brains' part, even if it's very clearly engineered as an excuse to do a memory wipe at the end. And it leads to a very hectic and fun final confrontation with all the Botsfords involved. Tim and Sally are running around actually having a lot of fun with these events.
Hey, no playing with the mechanical ear.
Oh, sorry.
Which makes sense given the last time they were in the warehouse, and while TJ is just angrily dumping his WordGirl merch on the ground, I love the irony that it's his attempts to reject WordGirl that end up saving her. But if we're talking about dinner, I can't forget the dinner sequence. From Tim and Sally treating Dr. Two Brains like a celebrity, which I guess he technically is, to Two Brains getting really into the mac and cheese being served, to the frustration both he and Becky exhibit, it's hilarious to witness. The episode just strikes an amazing balance between stress and relief. The interactions between Becky and her family after they learn the truth are obviously limited, but it's fun to see how they change here. While the plot is ultimately very predictable, the title itself literally spoils the ending, I really end up just not caring.
Will you two please stop quarreling? I don't want to have to separate you again.
Sorry, boss.
How long do you think it'll be until one of the henchmen accidentally calls Two Brains Dad?
You're banned! I'm just looking for the bathroom. You're banned from that too!
At the Plastic Cup Throwing Festival, the mayor is challenged by Mr. Big in a disguise that's worse than WordGirl's costume and Glenn's Two Brains mask combined. The mayor is mind-controlled into offering Mr. Big control of the city if he wins, which naturally happens. Later that night, WordGirl confronts Mr. Big in the mayor's office, but she has no hard proof and Mr. Big bans her from the city. As Becky and Bob plan to stop Mr. Big in their civilian identities, Mr. Big enacts a bunch of terrible laws. Scoops is forced to report only positive things about Mr. Big.
Mr. Big discovers the moon?
I worry the reputation of the Daily Rag will never be restored.
And Tim is forced to give Mr. Big his favorite tie. Becky poses as a Daily Rag reporter, at first stroking Mr. Big's ego, but then criticizing his lack of planning skills. This tricks Mr. Big into revealing his plans to cheat at the cup throwing competition, and Becky immediately reveals the mayor and some police to be in the next room. Mr. Big tries to run away, but WordGirl and Huggy capture him using a top hat, a water fountain, and a garbage bin. No, I'm not explaining how. WordGirl is unbanned, Tim gets his tie back, and the city is promptly returned to normal. I like the angle of forcing Becky to forego her superhero identity to save the day here. She has to think smarter to find a way to get in close and trick Mr. Big without using her normal tactics. Her plan, using the Daily Rag and hurting Mr. Big's pride, is both clever and leads to some pretty funny moments.
Say, when did you get a job at the paper?
The episode does a passable job selling the tension of a villain controlling the city. We mainly just get a bunch of posters plastered around the place, but seeing how miserable Scoops and Tim become, as well as the first City Hall scene being set during a nighttime thunderstorm, go a long way to make up for that. Part of the episode not being as tense as you'd expect probably stems from Mr. Big's role being mostly played for comedy. His laws are silly and arbitrary, and it's pretty clear he's just doing things because he can. How else can you explain this?
People will now greet one another by quacking, then hopping on one foot and saying, raspberry.
Even him claiming the power in the first place is played like this. The mayor is mind-controlled into wagering the city on a plastic cup throwing contest and then made to just drop his cup while Mr. Big drops his slightly farther. It looks as if Mr. Big was putting in the minimum effort possible, which is made even clearer if you look at his disguise. There might be something to say about Mr. Big being the villain most likely to try and claim governmental authority, but I'm not going to get into that until it becomes more of a pattern and less of a coincidence. So while this episode might be more lighthearted than one would think, it's WordGirl, what were you expecting? The show can get tense sometimes, but that's something that can only work if it's done in moderation, so I think this episode staying goofy and mostly not serious is best in the long run.
If your mother asks, I'll be at the tie store, trying to replace Murray.
Murray?
He names all his ties.
What have I done? I'm so sorry, Cornelius.
It's strange.
Where's my remote?
You mean this?
A meeting of TJ's WordGirl fan club is about to begin, and Becky gets kicked out while Violet stays. Shortly into the meeting...
Mr. President!
Johnson, you're late.
Johnson? I thought he didn't debut until season 4 or something. I don't remember him being here at all. Anyway, Johnson offers up a strange remote he picked up at a yard sale as payment to cover his dues, and TJ decides to use it for a WordGirl roleplay game. Meanwhile, Becky flies off when she hears that Tobey's robots are loose, but is confused by them just doing random nonsense. WordGirl confronts Tobey, who reveals his mom sold his master remote at a yard sale. WordGirl decides she and Tobey should team up to find the remote, and Tobey is eager to oblige, hiding the fact that he happens to have a tracking device. WordGirl and Tobey search the library, the museum, and the playground, with Tobey just treating everything like a date. The two actually start bonding as they realize how much they have in common, but after confronting a robot at the bank...
Stop that foolishness! I raised you better than that!
WordGirl's super hearing tips her off to the remote's location at the fan club meeting. TJ realizes the remote is actually controlling the robots and plays with it more until WordGirl, Tobey, and Huggy show up. WordGirl discovers Tobey had a tracking device and is naturally angry at how much time they spent on an unnecessary search. Tobey then fights TJ for the remote and attempts to destroy the clubhouse, but WordGirl destroys all the robots while he's distracted. If Department Store Tobey was the first episode to try and show how WordGirl and Tobey could be cute, this one straight up feels like a Tobecky fanfiction. The two team up and start to get along really well with each other, going on outings that end up having barely anything to do with the reason they joined up in the first place. The main difference is that everything ended up being the result of Tobey deliberately sidetracking them, and WordGirl ends up sour towards him again when she finds this out. There's no confession or explicit affection on WordGirl's part because the show has a status quo to keep, as opposed to a probably one-off story written by someone whose favorite trope is enemies to lovers. I do think it's a good thing in the long run that there isn't any genuine two-sided romance here, for reasons I'll discuss in a later Tobey episode, but this one does make the pairing look a bit more endearing in a vacuum at least. Even after learning Tobey wasted their time, WordGirl indirectly admits she had a fun time, and you get the sense her view on Tobey would be different afterwards if their outings weren't based on false pretenses. And the whole time, Huggy is there looking annoyed, like a big brother or father who doesn't want to see WordGirl get too close with the bad boy. But outside of WordGirl and Tobey's antics, this is our first proper introduction to the International WordGirl Fan Club, and, apparently, TJ's eventual best friend Johnson. There'll be a surprising amount to talk about with Johnson as the show progresses and he becomes more prominent in TJ plots, so I'm just gonna focus on the club subplot in general. It's rather one note, mostly just TJ messing with the remote, but it gets more entertaining near the end when Violet steps in to be the voice of reason and TJ starts to get drunk on his authority as president.
I say that I can say as president of the International WordGirl Fan Club as many times as I want, as president of the International WordGirl Fan Club.
Overall, it's mainly just an excuse for why the robots are acting weird and where the remote actually is, which it serves well as. I especially love that if Becky had been allowed to stay at the meeting, she could have solved the episode in the first 2 minutes. While I'm typically a bit hesitant on Tobey-centric stories, I will admit that this one was actually genuinely adorable and funny. I love the more casual air for most of it, the idea that while Tobey is wasting time, the robots themselves are acting more odd than destructive to semi-justify it. This feels like a story you might get if Tobey was actually a good guy, but his personality was mostly the same.
But no fair peeking and telling me how it ends.
This coming from you, Tobey?
But I already know. Z.
Oh, now, Coach, you look like you done this before.
I ain't never done this before.
After an ill-fated stint as Amazing Rope Guy's sidekick, the Whammer is dejected until he hears a commercial for a life coach named The Coach. Wanting to be more than just a sidekick, Whammer goes to see the coach, who tells him to go out and get something he wants right then.
Orange juice?
A man after my own heart, it would seem. At the Botsford home, Becky and TJ are fighting over what TV show to watch, with Becky wanting to see the finale of Pretty Princess Power Hour. After learning of the Whammer's actions on the news, Becky leaves to apprehend him, and TJ gets unexpectedly drawn in by Pretty Princess. Back at the coach's office, the coach realizes the Whammer is, in fact, a criminal.
Really? I just assumed you were a professional wrestler.
Come to think of it, that might have actually been the basis for his costume. Now I'm just imagining the Whammer getting fired from a wrestling league because his whams destroyed too many Jumbotrons. The coach realizes he can manipulate the Whammer into stealing things for him and tells Whammer to steal 2 cars, one for each of them. WordGirl fails to stop the Whammer from taking the cars, but after the coach has Whammer steal 2 yachts, she's able to get the upper hand. WordGirl learns about the coach's role in things and arrives with police to arrest him. The coach is at first happy to go to prison, seeing it as a way to start a villain school and get more criminals working for him, but...
You tricked the Whammer. Now the Whammer's gonna trick you, yeah?
Never would have thought the Whammer could sound intimidating. Becky gets back home having missed the Pretty Princess finale, but PJ excitedly fills her in before claiming he wasn't actually into it. I'm a bit torn over the concept of this episode. On the one hand, the Whammer going to a life coach to get out of his sidekick rut and ending up manipulated by the life coach is a cool concept. On the other hand, I'd have liked to see the Whammer be the designated sidekick for at least a little more than just one episode, not counting his cameo in Crime Takes the Holiday. Imagine the Whammer working with Granny May or Mr. Big. There's a lot of potential in this concept. Admittedly, like I mentioned before, reusing this concept could have easily ended up very samey, and he can still get villain team-ups in the future. I'm just disappointed we lose the specific flavor of Whammer trying and failing to be a sidekick. That said, he does sort of end up in that role unintentionally thanks to the coach taking advantage of him. He's so certain he's taking control of his own life, but doesn't realize everything he's asked to do is a trick.
Let me hear you say, I'm the boss! I'm the boss!
Side note, gotta give props to John C. McGinley for an amazingly hammy Whammer voice and Ned Bellamy's deceptively slimy coach. And speaking of the coach, he gets a great and pretty unique introduction. He starts off as just an ordinary guy trying to make people's lives better, but then you realize just how quick he snapped into encouraging crimes that he can profit off of. He thinks he's so clever, even to the point of spinning getting sent to jail as a positive, but his sudden hesitation when he realizes the Whammer has caught on to him is pretty gratifying. And as you'd expect, this is not the last we'll see of the coach as he works to make his ambitions come to fruition. Oh, what about the subplot?
I've gotta go. I forgot about my, kite flying practice. A pretty princess!
I think that's all I have to say there, actually. Well, just one more thing.
Oh my gosh, it was the best finale ever!
I'd like to mention that this episode came out in 2008.
I do not reiterate, repeat, reinstate the same thing over and over again. I am clear, concise, to the point.
Beatrice Bigsby, an employee at a copy shop, privately rants about how she deserves to be manager more than the current one, Dave, because...
He doesn't love the copiers like I love the copiers.
Let's just move past that for now. She eventually finds a button on the copier that, when pressed, merges her with the copier. We're 2 minutes in, and I can think of at least 3 different reasons why this is utterly absurd. The merging gives Beatrice a very super-villainous outfit, a compulsion to speak redundantly, and the ability to make duplicates of herself, which she plots to use to her benefit. A few days later, 3 unknown figures are stealing a couch, a sofa, and a futon. WordGirl and Huggy chase down the trucks, but are unable to catch the third one containing the couch. What's more, the drivers of the truck seemingly vanish, leaving behind only blank sheets of paper. Back at the copy shop, Beatrice seeds about how her plan to create the ultimate break room and prove her worth was impeded by WordGirl, and about how Dave is inferior to her despite how utterly nice he is. Later, Becky and Bob are walking with Violet when Becky decides to stop into the copy shop. When a customer brings up WordGirl, Beatrice goes on a rant and reveals she's the one who stole the furniture, unveiling her villainous identity of Lady Redundant Woman. Becky becomes WordGirl but is annoyed by LDR's redundant speak and taken off guard by her duplicating power. WordGirl and Huggy take out the duplicates one by one while Lady Redundant Woman makes more, until the dupes start immediately reverting to paper due to an apparent lack of ink. Lady Redundant Woman is carted off and fails to hide her appreciation for Dave's niceness. Wow, I forgot how cool and different Lady Redundant Woman was in this episode. Here, she's voiced by Amanda Plummer, who puts in a very unique performance for this show. Beatrice is simultaneously very dramatic and very low-key, the sort of thing that TV tropes refers to as a cold ham. This is best epitomized in her private monologues where she rants about the things that bother her in a low voice while the camera zooms in and shadows surround her.
So what if he's nicer than me, and he gives correct change, and he never once bit a customer on the leg?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that she's frightening, but she is imposing in a unique way, and it really sets her apart from her louder and more bombastic counterparts in the rest of the villainous cast. This also makes it stick out more when she's made to put on a fake friendly voice or awkwardly shows Violet where the stamps are.
Yeah, and there's a machine over there by the pens. Thanks.
Unfortunately, this version of Lady Redundant Woman wouldn't last, as this is the only episode where she's played by Plummer. We'll talk more about the Grey Delisle version of Lady Redundant Woman when she returns in a few episodes, but suffice to say that Delisle doesn't keep the unique vibe Plummer brings, and the character is also written differently then. But for this one episode, Lady Redundant Woman has maybe my favorite vocal performance in the whole show, with dialogue written to perfectly match it. Her motivation, desire to be manager of the copy shop and one-up Dave, is silly but still serves to make her more intimidating by showing how her obsession has affected her, especially with how comically polite and accommodating Dave is.
I'll find someone to cover your shifts.
Thanks, Dave. That's awfully nice. Direct.
But you can't be 100% intimidating in this show, so we also get to see Beatrice lovingly fret over a copy machine or the way her duplicates fight. And, of course, there's her tendency towards redundancy, which is not only funny, but it fits really well into a show about language. The way it influences her targets is a perfect balance of the two brains cheese thing and the just steal whatever philosophy of most villains. She steals multiple extremely similar things, but they could be anything based on whatever's on her mind that day. I never realized until this rewatch just how amazing Lady Redundant Woman really is in both concept and practice. The only major misstep of the episode is how she's beaten. Much like Granny Mae running out of fuel in the Spritzer episode, Beatrice running out of ink makes sense, but the way it just happens at random without WordGirl or Huggy doing anything specific to trigger it makes it feel very anticlimactic. It would have worked a lot better if, say, they managed to steal Beatrice's ink cartridge. And I know this because they do just that in a future episode. But aside from that, this is a great episode. I realize I've pretty much talked exclusively about the new villain, but that's because the lion's share of screen time goes to her, and there's not even a real subplot this time. At most, just Becky and Violet talking briefly before entering the copy shop. It's disappointing that this version of Lady Redundant Woman effectively dies here, but I'm very glad that we at least got to see her for a little bit.
And for the record, although I enjoy pepperoni, I prefer black olive and green pepper.
I seem to remember you saying black olive and green pepper pizza was your favorite.
That's right. Touche, Dave.
My hair! You're ruining my hair!
Dr. Two Brains and his henchmen are doing spring cleaning when they find an old ray that turns hair gel into cream cheese. Still not as weird as merging with a copy machine. WordGirl and Huggy, on patrol later, see the villains robbing a cheese store with the ray. Seems like a really dumb idea. The heroes confront them, but are hit with the ray themselves.
That wasn't so bad.
Oh, I guess it's not that dumb. Until WordGirl and Huggy just stop wearing hair gel at least. Back at the lair, Two Brains praises the henchmen for how much cheese they've gotten before the mouse brain flares up, compelling him to scarf down a piece immediately. At the spaceship hideout, WordGirl reflects on Boxleitner being taken over by the mouse brain and decides to go to his old lab to see if she can find a weakness of it. Upon arriving at the lab, they're met by one Professor Robert Tubing and his own monkey aide, Bosco. After Two Brains' origin is recounted, the Doctor is shown on TV demanding the entirety of a government stockpile of cheese and threatening to use his small handheld ray on everyone in the city if his demands aren't met. Okay, maybe now we've passed the copy machine thing. Tubing helps WordGirl figure out that cats might be the mouse brain's weakness, which she bashfully admits to having never tried. Two Brains' deadline arrives, and we see military officers trying to contact WordGirl and reluctantly giving up the cheese to Two Brains.
Well, the style of our nation's hair cannot be risked.
Tubing then shows up and offers to help remove the mouse brain, but when Two Brains refuses, Tubing signals WordGirl to begin Operation Weakness. This involves her and Huggy riding a giant flying mechanical cat head to terrify Two Brains. When the cat head grabs the mouse blimp, the hair gel ray falls out and presumably breaks on the ground. WordGirl and Tubing then say their goodbyes as the cheese is resecured. This isn't the first time Dr. Two Brains' fear of cats plays a major role. It's basically the sole reason Glenn was able to take over, but it's the first time it's a primary focus. It's a pretty obvious weakness to explore in the episode where weakness is a featured word, but I like how the episode is self-aware about how obvious it is.
Of course we just have cats. I mean, of course.
You've never tried cats, have you?
No.
Another thing that fleshes out Two Brains is the increased emphasis put on the mouse brain. We see it more strongly compel him to eat cheese, and later he outright refuses an offer to get rid of it.
Nah, I'd grown rather attached to it.
I've argued that Two Brains has come to embrace crime, hence the attachment, but it's also possible to argue Squeaky has a much greater influence on his words and actions than is immediately apparent, leaving it ambiguous how to interpret this scene. The whole ray that turns hair gel into cream cheese thing is absurd, as I hope I've conveyed, but it's absurd in a really good way. All the characters take it so seriously that it's hard to take them seriously, and what other show has its first appearance of military personnel involve threatening people's hair to get cheese? And lastly, this episode gives us Professor Tubing. Unfortunately, based on my research, he doesn't show up again, but it's nice to see a new ally Semi take up the mentor role that Boxleitner vacated far too soon. Tubing is more low-key than other characters on the show, but he's still a lighthearted and friendly character who's just enjoyable to watch. And the fact he has a charming monkey of his own doesn't hurt. This episode is a weird cross between a lore reminder and a delve into absurdity, but it pulls it off well. The references to Two Brains' backstory could be considered unnecessary, but they don't waste too much time, and re-emphasizing the way his mind works sort of makes sense given how this episode plays out. If you tend to take cartoon plots very seriously, you'd probably be annoyed by this episode, but people who are willing to go with the flow will appreciate how silly this is with a couple semi-serious moments.
A secret exit chute? Well, that thing's way too much trouble.
This just in. WordGirl hates fun. Tim serves his family spaghetti for breakfast to carbo load before competing in a car wash against their rivals,
the Mings.
Need to see Scoops' family, but I can't help but wonder if someone really wanted an excuse to shove star-crossed lovers into the Becky and Scoops dynamic. Exposition guy shows up to warn of someone trying to steal a gilded cleaver, so Becky and Bob leave and say they'll meet the others at the car wash. At the Kitchens of the Past Museum,
Our mayor will let just about anyone build a museum.
WordGirl is confused to see the criminal is not the Butcher, but a new meat-based villain, the Masked Meat Marauder. If it weren't for Lady Redundant Woman, this guy would have the best name in the show. The Butcher arrives and is displeased to see someone butting in on his niche. The two fight each other, and WordGirl, over the cleaver, but the Marauder grabs it while WordGirl and the Butcher are busy with the definition. Clever man. Becky arrives at the car wash, but learns from Scoops that Edith Von Housinghouse is having a party with a diamond-studded grill, so she leaves to intercept a very predictable crime. Naturally, the Butcher and the Marauder are fighting over the grill, but attack WordGirl together after she shows up. The Butcher is then able to use the Marauder's distraction to slip off with the grill, tying up their impromptu competition. Becky returns to the car wash again, but...
Piece of cake.
Help! The Butcher's on TV!
The Butcher issues a challenge for the Marauder: steal a priceless figurine, with the loser having to leave town. Becky leaves again to intercept the meat villains' duel, eventually tricking them into restraining each other. The Butcher gets to stay in town while the Marauder is shipped out to a prison in Meatropolis.
There's 23 butcher shops, a hamburger parade every Sunday, and no superheroes or superhero monkeys.
Becky gets back to the car wash and very blatantly uses her super speed in the open to turn the competition from a massive Ming lead to an exact tie, so Tim and Scoops' dad split the trophy in half. The masked meat Marauder is a delight, but he's one of those villains who works best as a one-hit wonder. He's a perfect inversion of the Butcher. Elegant, pompous, and wielding intricate and fancy meat dishes instead of just meats on their own.
Chicken a la king with Dijon vinaigrette.
It's great to see him and the Butcher meet up and not get along in the slightest, constantly insulting each other's styles. One detail I particularly like is that they're actually depicted as true, even rivals. While the Marauder outwits Butcher in their first encounter, it's the other way around the second time, and neither is shown with the upper hand in their last battle before WordGirl bests them both. I didn't remember the details of this episode going in, so I thought it'd involve the Butcher continually losing and needing to prove he's a good villain. But no, he is able to get the upper hand, and him winning by being allowed to stay in the city feels deserved without needing some grand display to justify it. Although given the whole Metropolis thing, it's definitely a Pyrrhic victory there.
No fair! I want to go to Metropolis!
Why weren't you already there? On the other side of the coin, the car wash plot wasn't great, but it wasn't boring, and it did have some good moments. Tim once again shows off his goofy side as he gets really into a car wash competition, deciding that the Mings must be beaten at all costs. I love how the rest of the Botsfords don't take things nearly as seriously, but the Mings apparently all feel similarly to Tim, even Scoops, despite being rather casual with Becky in the middle of it. And the fact that it's specifically a car wash instead of a more traditional competition like a sports game or, say, a scavenger hunt just reinforces the silliness. Oh, and speaking of silliness, there's actually one exposition guy appearance I skipped earlier. He shows up at the Housing house to yell about the state of the car wash before calmly walking off.
I don't remember inviting him.
Sometimes we need a little help getting to the next scene.
This is one of those episodes where it feels like they started with a featured word and wrote the story from there. Both the main plot and the subplot are heavily geared around the concept of rivals, and it works really well. The Marauder hits the perfect sweet spot where he's entertaining for the episode, but not so engaging that he upstages the Butcher or induces disappointment when he vanishes forever, mostly, at the end of the episode.
Wait just a minute now.
Hey! Split screen!
Why do you get to choose what we steal?
Get off my TV!
It's a little adventure I call
The Butcher.
Quest for the
Ye old butcher shop porcelain figure.
And you're not in it.
I want to go home! I want to go home! I want to go home! I want to go home!
When Chuck's newest evil plan is ruined by his mother's yelling, he decides it's time to move out and construct a new evil lair. The next day, Chuck calls WordGirl and Huggy to arrange a fight at the park, but then captures them and brings them to said new lair, a sandwich theme park called Sandwich World. WordGirl and Huggy are faced with sandwich-themed trap after sandwich-themed trap until a wall is broken open to reveal an air duct that Huggy slips into. WordGirl tries to keep Chuck distracted, but this gets her stuck inside a room with a descending ceiling. As Huggy goes for the controls, Chuck starts to miss his mom and gets second thoughts about the new evil lair thing. While Chuck is distracted by his emotional baggage, Huggy disables the death trap WordGirl is in just in time. WordGirl and Huggy fly off to avoid helping Chuck with moving, and Chuck returns to his mom's basement. I haven't really touched on Chuck living in his mom's basement up to now because it just came off like cheap "lol Chuck is pathetic" jokes, but this episode redeems that aspect of it. It's shown that Chuck legitimately cares for his mom beyond the annoyance he sometimes shows, and it's sweet to see him come to realize that during the climax of the episode. His feelings are also pretty clearly influenced by stress and cold feet over making the decision to move out so suddenly, but the episode leans more into his relationship with his mom. This is epitomized with the final shot being a photo of Chuck and his mom, though we're still not allowed to see her face and I'm not sure why. So between the emotional beats and the zaniness of Chuck's new lair, you'd think this is a really good episode, right? There's two major problems that hinder this episode. The first is that Chuck's homesickness comes on rather suddenly, so it feels more like an abrupt deus ex machina than a natural story beat. This could have been fixed by having Chuck let slip a few comments that show he's in denial about his feelings, or show him see something that reminds him of home and quickly avert his gaze. As a side note, they could also have added a framing device of Becky wanting independence from her parents and going through a similar arc to Chuck, but that might cause more of a time crunch. The second problem is that the Sandwich World theme park doesn't really live up to its potential. The traps are pretty unimaginative and just have a sandwich-themed coat of paint, and it's not as visually interesting as it could have been. The best looking room is the final one with the crusher, where the walls are painted like layers of a sandwich. It looks like WordGirl is actually inside a sandwich getting pressed. If the whole lair was as creative as that, it would have been a lot cooler. It's not all bad though. The voyage through the lair gives us some good jokes like notorious glutton Captain Hookyface saying Chuck's marshmallow cream is just okay, and the bumper car room is the most fun of the traps.
Well, I didn't want anyone to get hurt.
Okay. Kinda defeats the point, but I'm not complaining. For example, my lair is... Oh, wait. I probably shouldn't tell you.
I'll probably forget by the next episode anyway.
That's true.
It's pickle time!
Insert joke about trans women here.
Wow, we're really in a pickle.
This could have been a really fun and deceptively heartwarming episode, but it's held back by, well, holding back the context for the climax and how over-the-top Sandwich World could have been. The place didn't even feel like a lair, really, more like a giant death trap Chuck could have easily vacated after WordGirl was smashed into pulp. There's some missed opportunities here, but I wouldn't call for a do-over or anything. A small but comfortable basement is already something that fits Chuck's personality pretty well.
If it weren't for WordGirl, oh how I hate her. Well, hate is such a strong word. Let's just say I don't like her very much.
And you are that unfortunate person.
You're the one who framed me?
Yes.
Violet and Becky, spending the evening painting, discuss the prospect of being a superhero. Violet says she'd love to have superpowers, but Becky says she once heard from WordGirl that being a superhero isn't all it's cracked up to be. Exposition Guy then shows up to yell about the butcher robbing a deli.
Boy, that's the 5th time today.
After Becky leaves, a freak coincidence saves Violet from getting covered with paint, but she thinks she and the frame she's holding have gained superpowers from the full moon. Later, as Violet plans out her superhero life, she runs into a bank robber and introduces herself as the Framer. WordGirl apprehends the robber, but Violet becomes convinced she did it and that her powers are triggered by closing her eyes and turning away, because of course. The next day, WordGirl and Huggy find another random criminal.
I guess we should stop that guy anyway.
And Violet shows up in her new Framer costume. Violet apprehends the criminal, and we get a montage of her continually beating various supervillains while actually just being a distraction for WordGirl. Okay, I'm pretty sure Violet could beat Amazing Rope Guy on her own. WordGirl and Huggy finally find the butcher, but Violet's involvement leads to him getting away. Afterwards, at art class, Violet confides her superhero identity to Becky, who feigns awe before Exposition Guy shows up yet again.
I forgot about my doctor's checkup.
I forgot about Violet's doctor's checkup.
My mom's gonna be so mad.
Her mom's gonna be so mad.
How is Violet the more convincing liar? WordGirl, Huggy, and Violet face the Butcher again, and things go poorly until Butcher trips on the frame. Violet retires from heroing, thinking her powers are gone, though she believes they'll come back at the next full moon. If you're big into overanalyzing character beats, this is a really interesting episode. If not, it falls kinda flat. This episode shows us a lot about Violet that could be used to examine and interpret her appearances before and after. She wants to be a superhero like WordGirl, though isn't necessarily specifically inspired by her. This reminds me of how quickly she sprung to help save Huggy in The Birthday Girl, even putting herself at risk to stop Eileen at the end. Violet wants to help people and is aware of the risk that entails, even if her airheadedness prevents her from fully recognizing what's going on. And despite what you may expect from this premise, she doesn't choose to stop being a hero at the end. The only reason she hangs up the frame is because her non-existent powers are now non-existent. Wait. And while the Framer is never a thing again, I checked, it's clear that Violet is eager to take up the role again should the need arise. I'm just gonna assume she realized the truth about her powers at some point after this episode. This also ties into her friendship with Becky. Seemingly the first time they see each other after Violet gains her powers, she takes Becky aside and confides her secret identity to her.
Becky, can I confide in you?
Of course. Whatever could it be?
Okay. I'm a superhero named the Framer.
Go ahead and put a pin in that for literally the entire rest of the show. And she's also shown to care for WordGirl, eagerly fighting alongside her, showing sympathy for her struggles, and once again entering a small rage when the Butcher attacks her. The downside of the Framer is that she unfortunately isn't that funny. It's cute to see how enthusiastic she is, but the only major joke she gets is her accidentally deluding herself, and it's just not that funny, outside of the bank robber declining to reveal the truth because he doesn't want to disappoint her. I end up feeling sympathy for Becky's annoyance, but also frustration at how easily she gives up on trying to reveal the truth. The best jokes we get are from the Butcher.
Stop right there, Butcher!
No, you stop right there! Why do I always have to stop?
Party's over!
Aw, too bad, because I brought snacks! Wiener Schnitzel whammy!
This next one even ties into WordGirl defining catchphrase and does a little bit of lampshading.
Like how my meat
meat attacks all have little sayings that go with them, like sausage cyclone or pork chop chop.
Another issue, Becky telling Violet about WordGirl's struggles is neat character development in theory, but it doesn't really affect the story at all. It doesn't influence WordGirl's actions or thoughts, and it doesn't tie into Violet quitting superheroics because, again, she doesn't do so by choice. I think this episode would have been better if it was about Violet trying to make herself an additional sidekick of WordGirl to allow more variance in their interactions and remove the imaginary powers beat. If you wanted, you could give her actual powers or some sort of gadget and have her lose it at the end of the episode. Maybe even show her using art supplies to fight, throwing paint in villains' faces or something. That'd be fun. As it is, there's just not a lot of meat on this episode's bones.
Oh my gosh! Violet's in trouble! The butcher will have to wait.
Aw, that's sweet. She's letting the butcher go to help her girlfriend. Friend.
Inventing your own word shows creativity and vision. Visitivity.
Mr. Big is reveling in how great and successful his life is, but Leslie takes the wind out of his sails by revealing the newly constructed Wilrose building has surpassed Mr. Big's building as the tallest in the city. The building is the grand prize for the upcoming Business Palooza Fest, so Mr. Big decides to enter. The next day, the Botsfords are naturally attending Business Palooza Fest.
And, that guy, who manages the grocery store.
Good to know him not having a name is deliberate. At least, it is as of now. We're then introduced to a brand new business owner.
I'm Susie P. Snugglestein.
Why do I get the overwhelming premonition that she's also evil? Susie's presentation, however, is interrupted by an AC/DC knockoff concert put on by Mr. Big, who talks about all the valuable services his company provides.
Without Mr. Big Inc. and our ultra-modern hookah chicka bow wow, your Polly Wally doodle rates would be through the roof.
Frankly, I think the dictionary plan made more sense than this. However, it soon becomes clear that Mr. Big is also sabotaging his competitors.
Something strange here. Look at that old woman's shoes.
And, the mask. What is with that mask? No one ever acknowledges that. Various booths are destroyed one by one, and WordGirl is unable to prove Mr. Big's guilt. Later that night, the two finalists are Mr. Big Inc. and Susie P. Snugglestein's Cuddle Factory of Cuteness. Doesn't that sound like it'll be ironically twisted to evil? WordGirl gets to be a surprise judge, but she and the other judges, Sally Botsford and the mayor, are mind-controlled. How is this the first time that WordGirl herself is mind-controlled? Anyway, Huggy disables the mind control, and WordGirl challenges the finalists to describe their businesses in 5 real words.
Is mind control 1 or 2 words?
Susie wins, of course.
Drat! And I had my design plans all ready to go. It was going to be the biggest squishy bunny building in the city.
I almost thought frozen yogurt has supplanted the bunnies. Good to know some things never change. The highlight of this one is definitely Mr. Big's antics. Throughout the episode, he gets inexplicably fixated on frozen yogurt as his big motivation for getting the building, and I love how over the top he gets.
And so convenient, the sweet, creamy, frozen yogurt. I'd do anything to make it my own.
The whole gibberish plan is another goofy commentary on business tactics, saying impressive sounding things that don't mean anything to sucker people in. Admittedly, real companies are usually better at coming up with words that sound scientific or something instead of
Frumble gumble.
But I appreciate the attempt, and his efforts to sabotage his competitors are also entertaining while making a lot more sense. The best of these is obviously him dressing up as an old woman to accuse Reginald of selling him a $10,000 chocolate ring. His old lady voice is actually more convincing than I expected.
I demand that Reginald be disqualified!
And of course, at the end, he brings in his old faithful.
The mind control ray?
Oh, come on. We call it the you-know-what for a reason.
I like how they struck a balance between new stuff and the things Mr. Big always does. It makes them feel a bit more fresh. It's also nice that it once again allows Huggy a moment in the spotlight. But despite how fun this episode is, I think they could have done more with the concept of Business Palooza Fest. I'd have preferred to see more screen time for Mr. Big's rivals and his efforts to undermine them, as well as more zany one-off businesses. As it is, the only ones who get more than one line are Reginald and Susie, and the latter is also the most unique and interesting. And while I like how over-the-top cutesy Susie is, like a good guy version of Eileen, she's not really able to carry the episode. I'd say this episode is amusing and does some fun stuff with its premise, but I can't say it's much more than that. It's slightly disappointing, but overall just fine.
Like the words yarn goggle and hookah chicka bow wow? They don't mean anything. They're gibberish.
I call foul. WordGirl is blatantly biased against Mr. Big. I demand he be given the Will-Rose building immediately as restitution for this. We open on Chuck, who vents to the narrator about being stuck in a rut and wanting to do something new with his crimes. At that moment, he sees a commercial for a panther exhibit at the city zoo, inspiring him to take on a new identity.
The Handsome Panther! Yeah!
The Handsome Panther?
Yeah, why?
Meanwhile, Tim is preparing to build a monkey house for Bob, who gets annoyed when he learns this will be his permanent new living space. Becky's super hearing tips her off to a problem downtown, so she and Bob fly down there to see Chuck in a panther costume stealing a new sub sandwich recipe. After realizing the panther guy is Chuck, WordGirl is dumbfounded and Chuck says he's easing out of sandwich stuff. The Handsome Panther is then able to get away with the recipe.
And as for your secret recipe?
Yes, oui.
I'm a very fast reader. Start with a half a cup of flour.
Back at the Botsfords, Bob changes Tim's design so he at least has something nicer to live in before Becky hears an alarm at the zoo. The Handsome Panther reveals he plans on breaking all the panthers out and letting them run rampant, successfully opening the cage after breaking out his condiment blaster against WordGirl and Huggy, but the panthers don't do anything as they're only active at night. Chuck gives up, admitting he should have done more research on panthers and welcomes the police coming to get away from the rambling zookeeper. Bob sees his extravagant monkey house, but it's only a flat display, as the full thing will take years to complete. This episode just feels like a better version of Chuck ! It's a similar premise of Chuck having issues with his theme, but him being bored and wanting to try something new is a better idea. The Panther thing is pretty random and arbitrary, but I'm pretty sure that's the point. It's a random thing Chuck saw on TV and thought was cool, so he rushed out a new villainous identity and later admits to having done no research. He's clearly put some effort in, but not enough, as he more prioritizes his costume and unnecessary theme song,
Handsome Panther! Handsome Panther! Handsome Panther!
over actual Panther weapons and tactics beyond some admittedly impressive agility. Heck, his primary weapon is still just his condiment blaster, and he even spins his second usage of it as him tricking WordGirl into thinking it'd be phased out. Chuck trying and failing to get out of his comfort zone overall is pretty funny, particularly the final punchline of the Panthers lounging around and WordGirl's reactions.
Looks like all that's left is to take you to a cage called jail. I know it wasn't my best, but I just learned about the Panther thing like 30 seconds ago. I mean, give me a break.
The zookeeper is also a great one-off character. His voice is really nice, and I love him annoying Chuck with his rambling at the end. The monkey house subplot is okay, I guess? It's weird that Tim is treating Bob like a rowdy pet dog when we know he's as sapient as a human, but I guess people aside from Becky might not recognize this. But even if Bob wasn't sapient, I really hope Tim was exaggerating about Bob never coming inside again. Not even actual rowdy dogs are subject to that, and this feels like a bit of an extreme of Tim's daftness. That said, Bob modifying the design and learning his luxurious mansion will take years to complete was a funny payoff. This overall wasn't the funniest episode of the show, but it had enough good jokes to be worth watching. Although I have to wonder, is it possible Chuck's feelings here are influenced by the whole Sandwich World fiasco? Maybe the stress from that got associated with the sandwich theme as a whole, so Chuck is trying to move on in a desperate attempt to process his...
It's a piece of cake to bake a pretty cake. If the way is hazy.
While preparing to rob a bank, Butcher runs into two childhood friends of his, Baker and Candlestick Maker. The three, who are apparently a troublemaking trio in their youth, steal balloons and a pen from the bank. Meanwhile, a complicated cake Bob was preparing for Tim's birthday collapses, so he and Becky leave to get more ingredients. Becky tries to get ingredients from the grocery store manager, but he gets flour dumped on his head thanks to a troublemaking trio prank. Becky, seeing Butcher's involvement, goes WordGirl to chase him down. WordGirl happens upon the baker's bakery and decides to pop in for help with Tim's cake.
Oh, but there's no time to change.
The change is instant, isn't it? The narrator then prods WordGirl to just pop in with her costume.
Have you been reading ahead in the script again?
Maybe.
Baker and Candlestick Maker, who have never been involved in actual crime before, become convinced they're about to be arrested. WordGirl's super hearing leads her into the back room where the trio is holed up, and she fights Butcher after he confesses to his friends he's a criminal and not an ordinary butcher. The police show up, but WordGirl agrees to let Baker and Candlestick Maker go in return for them making restitution and helping her with a cake and candles. Tim's extremely specific cake goes over well, and Butcher reminisces about his friends from his jail cell. This episode was actually inspired by an 18th century nursery rhyme called It even goes so far as to have characters recite the poem while the troublemaking trio are, like the rhyme says, literally in a tub.
Turn 'em out! Knaves all three!
I don't get it.
Really wearing your influence on your sleeve there. I love the implication that these three may have deliberately themed themselves around the rhyme, and I like what it shows about the Butcher specifically too. Him being a prankster in his youth makes a lot of sense, and here he reverts to that state out of nostalgia when he meets his friends again. But while Baker and Candlestick Maker have gone on to live normal, healthy lives, Butcher has gone to the extreme of his past ways and become a criminal. Wait a second.
I don't own a butcher shop. I steal stuff.
Well, that's one pointless mystery solved. Anyway, while I like the contrast, the plot of the Butcher trying to hide his criminal activities from his friends is the most bog-standard keeping a secret story ever. It's pretty predictable and boring, not helped by the fact that we don't get any actual fallout. Baker and Candlestick Maker don't get to express any emotion about the revelation beyond shock because immediately afterwards, Butcher is defeated and the police show up. They probably could have just axed that concept and have the two know the Butcher is a criminal from the start. Have them say they've seen him on the news but aren't actually upset about his crimes when they meet him at the bank. That said, I think the episode's current state works well for the concept of Baker and Candlestick Maker getting involved with WordGirl and feeling in over their heads. This probably could have been done with the two wanted to join the Butcher as sidekicks or something, but this plot works fine for that angle, and I do like the idea of a dangerous criminal being reduced to very petty theft and silly pranks.
Are you here pulling a goofy prank?
What? No, I'm here casing the joint.
This episode also probably has one of my favorite subplots. Having Becky and Bob make a cake is a brilliant way to tie their goals into the troublemaking trio's antics by providing an excuse to witness the grocery store prank, getting them to Baker's bakery, and providing a final punchline with them enlisting Baker and Candlestick Maker's help. Butcher even gets to join in.
Do they like pot roast?
This is just overall a charming episode. While the Butcher keeping secrets aspect could have been better, it's just funny and sweet to see him reconnecting with old friends and pulling pranks that are pretty harmless compared to his usual MO. Though I do have to wonder why Butcher gets jailed while Baker and Candlestick Maker get to go free. I'd like to say it's due to him attacking WordGirl at the bakery, but Chuck got away with nearly crushing WordGirl to death a few episodes ago, so I'm not sure how assault and attempted destruction are prosecuted in this world. Maybe it's just an excuse to pull the breakout tool hidden in a cake trope.
Well, okay, they both want power and are both evil, and evil doesn't work well with other evil, but still...
Tobey and Dr. Two Brains run into each other at a villain convention and turn out to be fans of each other's work. When Two Brains talks about a super strong metal he accidentally created, Tobey suggests the two team up, and Two Brains agrees. At the park, Tim is once again getting way too into a competition, this time a scavenger hunt.
Scavenger quest!
Because apparently no Botsford has ever completed one. His mental state is not helped by Violet's family being 2 items away from winning. Jeez, now Tim's gonna have a blood grudge against the Heathlips too. When she hears robot sounds, Becky flies off to find a giant mouse robot built and controlled by Tobey and Two Brains, which surprises her.
Isn't playing well with others against evil villain rule number 344?
Makes sense that'd be a thing.
Rules are made to be broken.
That also makes sense. WordGirl is unable to even dent the robot and is easily flung away, though this does allow her to find one of the items for the scavenger hunt.
Scavenger quest.
Of course. Tobey and Two Brains' partnership, however, starts falling apart when they disagree on what to target and who deserves the most credit for Mousezilla. When WordGirl shows up again, Two Brains nearly has the robot squeeze her to death, but Tobey objects, leading to a fight over Tobey's crush. When a famous cat shows up and terrifies Two Brains, the argument intensifies, allowing Huggy to take the remote. WordGirl flings Mousezilla into the ocean and dumps the villains into a police van. Hey, this is Tobey's first time actually getting arrested. They grow up so fast. Becky reunites with her family, which is missing just one item for the hunt.
Quest!
I know, but Becky comes up with an idea.
Here's the rarest Violet of them all, and she's wearing pink!
But a girl named Violet wearing a pink shirt doesn't cut it.
No!
So basically, no one ends this episode happy. Here we have the show's first team up between two villains, unless you count Chuck and Whammer and Thorn and the Sidekick. Tobey and Two Brains, the most science-focused villains on the show, make a good pairing and actually have good chemistry too. You get the sense that if they didn't end up falling out, they could have entered a long-term mentor-student relationship. But of course, they eventually come to blows over their own egos and personal weaknesses. They start out friendly, but it quickly becomes clear they're a very fair-weather partnership, as they don't really even try to compromise or otherwise rationally resolve their differences.
We need to get super villain team-up counseling.
And much like in Mecha Mouse, the day is saved by WordGirl WordGirl and Huggy's teamwork, Huggy freeing WordGirl to allow her to dispose of Mousezilla. Speaking of Mousezilla, it does a pretty good job coming off as intimidating. It's bigger and bulkier than Tobey's previous robots, and Two Brains' special metal makes it invulnerable to all of WordGirl's attacks. Between that and how easily it's able to subdue WordGirl, it's pretty clear she'd be doomed if it weren't for Tobey and Two Brains getting sidetracked. And the fact it was only created through a one-time collaboration decently justifies why neither of them can make something on this scale again. I also like the subplot of the scavenger hunt.
Scavenger quest!
Please shut up. Seeing Tim get worked up while the rest of his family doesn't take things nearly as seriously is still a treat, and I love the running gag of Becky accidentally happening upon her assigned objects during superhero action. Special mention to the Abe Lincoln Pinecone, which triggers an amusing conversation.
We'll never beat the superheroes! They're too super!
Where WordGirl claims to be helping Becky out and insists a technicality makes it completely okay. And I love how the ending hard subverts the last second breakthrough and win by technicality you'd be expecting by this point. This is overall a really good episode. The main plot may be pretty predictable, but it's a fun ride on the way, and the subplot is a really nice supplement.
And I found a pair of 19th century gym socks. They weren't on the list, I just found them.
I have no joke here, I just really wanted an excuse to show that clip.
And the first level of this game is going to school.
Something's happening in there.
Oh good, I thought this was going to be an episode where nothing happened. The coach welcomes the first students of his new official villain school. They consist of Timmy Timbo, who acts like a bored and or stoned college student and has the power to nap a lot, Big Left Hand Guy, who warrants no explanation, and Miss Question, who speaks entirely in questions. The coach assigns them to steal Michelangelo's whistle, which allows one to control anyone who hears it. Meanwhile, WordGirl and Huggy are practicing a new throwing move that they can't seem to nail, but head off when they hear the break-in at the Whistle Museum. Yeah. WordGirl and Huggy confront the students, who naturally don't do well. They only escape due to the heroes flopping the throw move and Big Left Hand Guy summoning a taxi. Back at the school, the students are berated for failing to steal Michelangelo's whistle before the coach brings in an additional instructor, the Whammer, who apparently made peace with the coach in jail. Whammer accompanies the students back to the museum, and another fight with WordGirl and Huggy ensues. Timmy, Ms. Question, and Whammer are all subdued, but Big Left Hand Guy summons another escape taxi out of nowhere while WordGirl gives Huggy a pep talk about their new move. The heroes follow Big Left Hand Guy to the coach's place but are enthralled by the whistle, until it turns out to double as a dog whistle, causing the coach to drop it for Huggy to snag with the new move. Thorn and the Sidekick leading into this is probably the only actual multi-episode storyline this show has, as in not just a running gag. We get to see the payoff of Coach's plans to build a school to enlist more people to steal things for him, and it goes about how you'd expect. The students are all barely competent, and their abilities aren't exactly up to snuff with the show's more famous villains. Timmy Timbo is easily the most pathetic. He doesn't even get any speaking roles for the rest of the series, and it seems like he dropped out at some point. Big Left Hand Guy is the obvious standout, as his power is blatantly obvious and put to use in a genuinely funny and clever way. Him summoning taxis like magic is amazing. Ms. Question isn't much better in terms of effectiveness than Timmy, but she at least has some sort of gimmick. Speaking only in questions sounds like it could get grating, but she has just enough lines to not annoy the viewer. She's actually legitimately funny at times, and I like having another character with a language-related gimmick.
You've all passed your first villainy test. Listening.
Oh, yay. Did you know he was gonna do that?
Oh, and she also becomes by far the most prolific of the three because her next appearance takes a really big swerve, but we'll get to that. Also, her hair is filled with question marks, and that's adorable. Together, this dynamic trio does such things as posing, stealing all the whistles because they don't know which is the correct one, and getting carried by Big Left Hand Guy. And their teacher, the coach, is even better than his last appearance. He's just as capable of sliminess and hamminess as last time, but now gets to also show his annoyed side with the students' antics. His highlight, though, is how dramatic he gets in his victory speech at the climax.
And I, the coach, will become a legendary unstoppable force.
And the Whammer is also there. It's hard to find him not entertaining, but his presence feels unnecessary and it makes the episode feel a bit overstuffed. They could have just had Coach give the students some wisdom before returning to the museum that helped them put up just enough of a fight against WordGirl. That said, I find it hilarious how the episode uses the featured word legendary for this because the Whammer has only had 2 major roles before this. I like to think Coach was talking Whammer up to make himself seem more impressive. Meanwhile, the plotline of WordGirl and Huggy's new move is fine. It's very predictable, but it still manages to feel victorious when the move succeeds at the climax, and I like how it ties into the feature word novice. This was overall a pretty good introduction to the villain school. Looking into it, the coach and the school itself actually get very few appearances after this, but their legacy lives on with several villains who get their starts at the school going on to become recurring threats in their own rights. I, for one, am looking forward to seeing what these guys get up to.
Less time inspiring you.
It's always annoying to remember villains don't just freeze up during dramatic speeches.
He could be in this very room. He could be you. It could be me. He could even...
Lady Redundant Woman, in jail, sees a commercial for the Triple Dip Ball and becomes determined to win it. After tricking the guard into removing the lock on her nose, she summons duplicates and breaks out. The next day, Huggy's testing of a shockingly good disguise kit is interrupted by an alarm going off at a dress shop. WordGirl learns the thieves stole 3 dresses in similar shades of blue, then overhears an alert for a fancy shoe store. Lady Redundant Woman, having nearly completed her ball outfits, learns of 3 golden necklaces at the jewelry store. Outside the shoe store, WordGirl catches on to who the thief is before Exposition Guy reveals Lady Redundant Woman has escaped from prison.
Where were you 3 scenes ago?
Sorry, my bus was late.
Wait, if he specifically meant to signal WordGirl, does that mean he knows her secret identity after all the times he's shown up around Becky? WordGirl and Huggy then leave for the jewelry store, where the dupes were only able to take 2 of the 3 necklaces.
Using all my cleverness, I was able to heroically rescue the 3rd necklace. Alright, one of them tripped on the rug and dropped it.
I love Reginald. WordGirl, learning Reginald has a box full of fake pendants, prepares to set a trap. Lady Redundant Woman returns as Beatrice Bigsby and gets held up by Reginald before he turns out to be an incognito Huggy. She summons her duplicates but is forced to delete them when they're tricked into fighting over the fake necklaces. A scuffle between LDR and WordGirl ends with the necklace being flung into a surviving dupe.
You look great! Yes! That's right! Run for the hills!
Beatrice is arrested and Huggy wins the Triple Dip Ball himself. And here we go with the new, not really improved Lady Redundant Woman. Compared to last time, she feels a lot more standard for this show. Her voice is louder and more bombastic, which feels less unique than her colder original voice while not being as endearingly over the top as Whammer or other villains, and her speech patterns follow a similar trend, giving up the quiet, bitter ranting for hammy declarations.
Me, myself, and I! Oh, and there's also moi and yours truly.
I don't think this new version of Lady Redundant Woman is bad, but it's a big disappointment after how cool she was last time. The episode itself does still do some fun and funny things with her though. The redundant crimes are as amusing as ever, and I love the climax with all the duplicates fighting each other. They may all be the same person, but that means they share the same ego and envy we've seen previously, and turning that on each other was clever on WordGirl's part. We also get to see her lair for the first time, and it's pretty much what you'd expect. But the funniest parts of the episode were Huggy's disguises. It's the sort of thing that feels like it should be one note, but there's a lot of variety in it. We see him become a mannequin for some reason, pop out of a fire hydrant, and do this.
Hello, officer.
Huh?
And of course, like previous great subplots, it ties into the main story naturally thanks to Huggy's disguises serving as great traps for Beatrice. Not just once, but twice. I think the voice change makes me feel a bit more negative towards the episode than it actually deserves, but in isolation, it's a pretty fun one. While I preferred Amanda Plummer, Grey DeLise does well enough under the circumstances, and it might have been best she didn't try to copy a performance that may or may not have been within her wheelhouse.
That is the only real pendant in Penzance.
My ridiculously circuitous plan is 1/4 complete.
Dr. Twobrains and his henchmen get back from executing a very complicated and exhausting plan, only to learn they got barely any cheese from it. Twobrains decides to go back to basics and execute some exceedingly simple plans. Meanwhile, Becky is trying to sell a large amount of dolls for a fundraiser. Unfortunately, everyone finds them hideous and repulsive. She's sidetracked by Twobrains robbing the grocery store, but shows up too late to stop him from grabbing some cheese and eating it immediately. Two Brains distracts her with the "look behind you" trick and escapes.
Milliseconds later, at the cheese shop across the street,
Two Brains once again just grabs and eats cheese there and then, and manages to escape once more via...
Escape by throwing cheese at us?
Back at the lair, the Mouse Brain is unsatisfied with the small amounts of cheese they've been stealing, and Two Brains learns about an event the next day involving an entire stadium full of cheese. Later, Becky is still struggling to sell her dolls, but then Two Brains shows up, wanting to buy them for his new plan. Forced into a moral quandary, she ultimately decides not to sell.
Actually, I'll take all of them.
Can I help you carry them to your van?
Two Brains attempts to formulate a relatively simple plan, but the henchman pointing out holes causes him to add more and more steps. WordGirl shows up, but gets locked up while the three leave. While Huggy frees WordGirl with the key, Two Brains carries out his plan, and it actually goes well. WordGirl, however, pulls the "look behind you" back on him and ties him up. This may be my favorite Dr. Two Brains episode so far. The idea of a supervillain wanting to get back to basics but falling into old habits and making their plans complicated anyway is a really funny idea. And as shown in the last video, Two Brains fits this really well. Him doing stuff as simple as grabbing and eating cheese while taking manic pride in it is a great juxtaposition, and WordGirl being flummoxed by the sudden shift is just as funny.
I already did. Haha, you lose.
What? Where?
But Two Brains' not-so-simple plans, both at the beginning and at the end, are also really fun. I like how we're never given all the details. This does help with not chewing up too much time, but it also leaves it up in the air how all these factors fit together, making it seem more nonsensical and thus funnier. Another moment I really like is when Two Brains is trying to placate the Mouse Brain. His voice acting is just a bit more manic and desperate as the Mouse Brain voices its displeasure, and it gets worse when he hears about the stadium.
And really, how complicated could it be to steal a stadium full of cheese?
The doll subplot is just kind of there, but Two Brains showing up to buy them is hilarious, as is him fretting about them at the end.
Hey, buddy, is there any way you could move these hideous dolls? They're creeping me out.
sorry, no can do.
This is yet another episode where WordGirl and Huggy themselves aren't the biggest deals. Their funniest moments are their initial reactions to Two Brains' new tactics, but it gets carried by the absurd shenanigans the villains get up to. As time goes on, I'm noticing I'm having less and less to say about the heroes, since the villains tend to drive the plot the most and do the most unique and interesting things. I really hope this changes over time. While I like the show's villains, I don't want WordGirl herself to just become a hanger-on.
That cheddar is the best that money could buy.
I'm stealing it.
Then it's the best that money could steal.
My machinations lay undetected for years, for I'm a master of deception.
A battle between WordGirl and Granny May is interrupted by the mayor showing up. Thinking fast, Granny uses her sweet old lady act to weasel into his good graces. Later, she convinces the mayor to pass several laws that would make it easier to rob places. Becky's efforts to build a massive, ugly keychain for her mom are interrupted by Granny's crimes, while the mayor refuses to believe she's evil. WordGirl then lets slip about a huge cache of gold that Granny May naturally heads off for. WordGirl confronts Granny May later that night with a man in a Captain Huggy Face suit.
It's past Huggy's bedtime, and I didn't want to wake him, so I called in a last-minute replacement.
Take a quick guess who it is. The mayor learns firsthand what Granny May is really like, and WordGirl takes her down with the help of the real Huggy. Becky finishes her keychain, and...
Holy cow!
I'm with you, Bob.
I think this is the first episode that I had completely forgotten about prior to starting this retrospective. I'd like to say this isn't necessarily a reflection of its quality, but... I'm not gonna harp on the mayor somehow not knowing about one of his city's most infamous criminals, but him taking Granny May's suggestions only really makes sense because the mayor has already been established to be kind of dopey. And the idea of Granny May grandmothering the mayor in his office is amusing, even if it runs on more of him being rather immature. There might be something to say about Granny May influencing the mayor with a philosophy of toxic positivity.
Now, remember what I said about focusing on happy things?
But the lack of any real rebuttal to this philosophy indicates to me that this was only meant as a manipulation tactic and not an attempt to tackle it as a theme. This also isn't that funny of an episode. While I called the premise amusing, it wears out its welcome thanks to getting pretty repetitive, and there aren't many jokes outside of this premise. The best exception would be Granny May's reaction to WordGirl's keychain.
It's a keychain for my mom to show her how much I appreciate her.
With that, you sure you know what appreciate means, dear?
And I did get a chuckle out of the mayor dressing up as Captain Huggyface, especially the indication that he really wanted to wear the costume. However, the mayor's reaction to Granny May's deception is hampered by the fact that the mayor's voice isn't really equipped for heartbroken betrayal, so that part of the scene falls flat a bit. This is ultimately just a very unremarkable episode. I'd honestly say my favorite part of it is the title.
My whole good mood is ruined. I hope you're happy with yourself.
I am happy with myself. I have a positive mental attitude.
Hoo boy, this is one I've been looking forward to discussing. Becky, Violet, and Bob are entering a Young Inventors competition with a combination egg slicer and apple core, but then Tobey shows up. Becky turns into WordGirl, but quickly discovers Tobey is simply entering his robot into the competition, and claiming to have turned good. WordGirl continually checks on Tobey throughout the day, in the process leaving Violet high and dry to present the core slicer on her own. Tobey consistently just does good things, while mumbling about winning WordGirl's love, and WordGirl is almost convinced he's being genuine. When the core slicer wins the competition, however, Tobey loses it and has his robot go on a rampage. WordGirl and Huggy are almost crushed by the robot, but Violet throws the core slicer to WordGirl.
My robot and I are so scared of your ridiculous... Hey! What are you...
Fatality. Tobey is taken by the police, and Violet is given another prize for saving the day. Huh, second Tobey episode in a row where he gets arrested. Is Claire out of town or something? So yeah, the episode where Tobey pretends to turn good. This really encapsulates a lot of my thoughts about Tobey and how he's often depicted in fan works. While he's shown doing good things, it's made clear he's specifically acting like this as a ploy to gain WordGirl's affections. The thing is, even if he didn't succumb to his ego at the end, this redemption was doomed to failure from the start because it lies on a foundation of ulterior motives. Tobey hasn't realized the error of his ways, he's just trying to placate a specific person. It actually comes off as a bit creepy the way he mumbles about WordGirl, drawing into focus how he's kind of trying to manipulate her.
Oh, WordGirl, you don't have to trust me. You just have to love me.
And if WordGirl doesn't reciprocate his feelings, or he's angered by something else in the future, the same events would probably end up playing out. For a Tobey redemption to stick and feel natural and satisfying, it would have to be because he wants to better himself, not to try and gain something. Or someone. But enough about the ethics and practicality of redemption, let's talk about yelling.
Robot!
Wait for it.
Destroy!
And there it is.
Patton Oswalt is a very famous performer, and he's done well with Tobey so far, but his voice acting after Tobey loses it really stands out. You can feel the rage Tobey is brimming with after having to play goody-good all day and losing a competition that even I agree he should have won. And it really sells the idea he's so overwhelmed with anger, he's perfectly willing to, annihilate the girl he loves just to vent his feelings. Prior to this though, I like how WordGirl is so hesitant to trust Tobey early on. After everything he's done, if he just abruptly turns good, it'd be hard not to suspect some kind of trick or potential relapse, which does happen. I've seen several Tobeki fics where WordGirl transitions into trusting Tobey far too quickly, so it's good to see the show has a decent sense for how this would actually go. But I honestly think my favorite part of this episode is Violet. Her apparent stage fright overwhelming her is very endearing and funny.
Thank you!
This episode just has a lot of yelling, doesn't it? And once again, Violet is willing to step in and save WordGirl, with the added bonus of her tiny invention being able to decimate Tobey's robot. Maybe it was just WordGirl's super strength, but I like to think Violet and Becky accidentally created the ultimate weapon. Hey Violet, maybe pull this thing out next time you want to try superheroing. This was a very interesting episode for what it says about Tobey and the possibility for him turning good, but it also managed to be very funny. It's one of the episodes more worth taking seriously, but it simultaneously pushes for some of the goofiest and most over-the-top stuff on the show. For example,
rocket to Mars and build a colony for our expected astronauts. The possibilities are limitless.
Tobey? What? Can we get an episode where Tobey builds a space station or something?
So of course he couldn't just stop at one use for these things. I mean, they're bongos. There's a million things he can do with them.
Chuck receives a radio in the mail. After he turns it on, the radio announcer talks about how listeners can make themselves mightier. with the surprisingly specific suggestion of disable all the security cameras at City Hall. Chuck leaves to do just that as the radio plays a bongo performance, but we soon learn the man behind the radio is Mr. Big, manipulating Chuck for unknown reasons. At City Hall, Becky is getting a pet license for Bob.
Dog or llama?
He's a monkey.
So, llama then?
Gonna be a long episode.
Bud is interrupted by Chuck's antics. Chuck gets away and soon receives new instructions from the radio. Tie up all of City Hall's security guards. After another failed fight, WordGirl has City Hall covered in wooden barriers, but Chuck tunnels underground with sandwich-warming gloves. Chuck approaches a briefcase he heard about on the radio, but Mr. Big emerges and reveals his involvement. WordGirl pops in and gets immobilized again, but Chuck frees her to stop Mr. Big. After Mr. Big is stuck in a crate, WordGirl, Chuck, and Huggy crack open the briefcase to find a key to the city. Mr. Big is arrested, and Chuck is let off easy with just cleaning up his mess in City Hall. Oh, and Becky and Bob get their pet license.
Here's a ferret license. Best I can do.
We'll take it.
I have no idea who came up with the idea of putting Chuck and Mr. Big together, but it works surprisingly well. Chuck's whole thing here is wanting to prove he's mighty, which feels decently natural. He's always come off as one of the more insecure villains on the cast, and Mr. Big is able to exploit this by giving him some remarkably specific things to do to prove his might. This is a bit odd for Mr. Big, no Leslie and no mind control, but the latter is actually justified in story by him saying it wasn't even necessary.
But with Chuck here, good old-fashioned advertising and false promises did the trick.
Maybe some more commentary a la Mr. Big's debut episode? It does keep his shtick of manipulating people from the background, admittedly. And I love how the ultimate goal was just a key to the city, something that's already been rendered mundane with how many WordGirl seems to collect over the show. But my favorite moment of the episode is Chuck freeing WordGirl and Huggy to stop Mr. Big. Not only does it involve the amazing sandwich-warming gloves, but it also serves as a really good coda to Chuck's arc this episode. All his actions here are about pride, and now that he knows it was a trick, he's willing to accept his consequences and help his enemies to preserve his pride. The voice acting and framing also just do a really good job of selling the climactic feel of the moment.
You know what? I'd rather go to jail than see you get away.
I will say that this isn't necessarily one of the funniest episodes, the woman giving out the licenses is the highlight there, but I think the episode makes up for it with the unusual but engaging villain pairing and the dramatic and fun climax.
So long, weak girl and Captain Weaky Face.
Chuck, never get involved with a roast, you're just gonna get it turned into your own roast. Dr. Two Brains' plans to break out of prison with a blackout ray are interrupted when Glenn Furlblam is made his cellmate and he steals the ray to escape himself. Glenn then tapes two fake brains to his head to become Dr. Three Brains and commit better versions of the crimes Two Brains had planned. WordGirl and Huggy, beaten by the blackout ray, go to Two Brains in jail and inform him of what's going on. Two Brains informs them of what the next crime is, and also that the blackout ray grows stronger with each use, potentially to the point of blacking out the city forever. Glenn escapes from the heroes once more, and they race to catch him at the third and final target, only to realize they're too late.
Come on! Go! Giddy up!
Technically. With the help of Bossy the Cow, Glenn is defeated, and WordGirl has a little bit of pathos with Dr. Two Brains as the episode ends. I thought going into this video that I'd find Glenn really annoying, but both of his episodes so far have shown him to be surprisingly entertaining, albeit in kind of a pathetic way. Even here, where he's shown to be a bit more of a threat, there's a bunch of caveats. His weapon and his crimes are stolen, and his ideas on how to improve said crimes are...
Whoa, Huggy! What was that? A strawberry?
Everyone knows that cheesecake is much better with strawberries.
Yeah, strawberries. As in more than one?
Though his final crime is my favorite, stealing a tub of rare cottage cheese from a famous cow and stealing the cow as well. Even WordGirl admits to this being an actual good improvement. Mostly.
But using the cow for your getaway? Not so smart.
The final battle is pretty brief, but I liked Huggy enlisting the cow herself to fight Glenn. But even after all this, Glenn still gets upstaged by Two Brains. He takes on a pseudo Hannibal Lecter role, and it suits him pretty well. In his first meeting with WordGirl, his depiction is more silly with his reactions to Glenn's antics.
What? That
That's copyrighted! If he keeps this up, nobody will take multiple brain villains seriously anymore. It's bad for business.
But in the second meeting, he puts on the veneer of being creepy, but it's still hard to take him that seriously. One detail I like is how he starts chirping like a mouse, as if the mouse ring is exercising a bit more control over him.
Hello, WordGirl. Did you enjoy your cheesecake? Or couldn't you find it in the dark?
And after Glenn is defeated, WordGirl and Two Brains reflect on their working together, but accept that they're still going to be hero and villain going forward.
If only things were different.
Yes, it's too bad.
WordGirl's friendly relationships with her villains is typically played for comedy, but here it's different. It feels like a coda of sorts on Two Brains' story up to now. He and WordGirl accept that things can't go back to the way they were, but they don't have to hate each other or anything.
But I'm not giving up my evil quest for cheese.
And I'll never tire of bringing evildoers to justice.
If WordGirl was a more serialized show, I could actually see this episode existing mostly unchanged. Granted, this isn't the last time this plot point will come up, but it really makes this episode feel like a bit more of a finale when I legitimately thought it'd be just another episode. This one was just full of surprises overall.
Could you do me a favor and not tell any of the other villains?
Sure.
So now that we're done with Season 1, I thought it'd be fun to look back on it and see what the best and worst of it was. To make things a bit more interesting, I'll be going on episode pairs instead of just individuals. With that said, my favorite episode pair of the season is Jerky Jerk and Becky's Birthday. Becky's Birthday really carries here. It has a lot of good jokes and a more distinct feel thanks to a different sort of villain. And its use of Dr. Two Brains is somehow more entertaining than most Two Brains focused episodes. Jerky Jerk isn't as good, but it's fun to see the Butcher in a new, more threatening light, and there's still some good jokes with some great timing. And admittedly, nostalgia is also a pretty big factor for it. My least favorite pair would probably be Violet Superhero and Big Business. There's worse individual episodes than these two, but I couldn't in good conscience nominate, say, Chuck ! Because it's paired with the much better Down with Word Up. These two are just both unremarkable. Violet Superhero has a cool premise, but squanders its potential on a repetitive joke that wasn't even that funny to begin with. The most value it has comes from overanalyzing character beats that rarely ever become relevant again. And Big Business is in a similar boat. When it takes advantage of its setting, it's decent, but it would have been better served cutting the gibberish plan for more time exploring Business Palooza Fest and seeing Mr. Big mess with more interesting competitors. Or at least just showing Susie more. Overall, Season 1 wasn't perfect, but it was pretty entertaining and a good start to the main series. Probably as a result of the shorts, the series got into its groove pretty quickly, and there's few, if any, cases of something being thrown at the wall and not sticking. But next time, we're moving on to Season 2, where the series goes high def, introduces more new villains, and even gives us our first multi-part episodes. Next time on
Stop.
Prepare for... Whoops, wrong member.
I'm hip, I'm fun, I'm totally chillin'.
I almost let you sign my sauce brush.
I don't think I want to hear any more of your stories, WordGirl. You're under arrest.
What? No, I mean, that hum could be coming from anywhere.
Actually, it's coming from a giant radio tower sitting right on top of Mr. Big's building.
How long until one of the villains complains that the narrator helping out WordGirl is cheating?